I want to talk about a massive economic pile driver that could be coming our way here in Australia. But before we can do any of that, let's spend one tiny little minute talking about the Albanese government and hypocrisy and the pandemic. Now, recall how over the months leading up to the election, Labour and the left and much of the media slammed Scott Morrison for screwing up the rat tests. He didn't order enough, and then he didn't make them free. Nobody could get a rat. Remember that? In January, Anthony Albanese tweeted that rapid antigen tests should be free, complete with a little meme made up there by ALP headquarters. He said that they should be free because, well, we are in a pandemic. It's a pandemic which much of the left is keen to remind us, by the way, is not over. Well, now new health minister Matt Butler is claiming that there is, everyone's favorite word, misinformation around criticisms of his government, the Albanese Labour government abandoning free rats. He said,
and that was always intended to run for 6 months. That was the budgeted position of the Commonwealth government put in place by the former government, and the budgeted position, as far as I understand it, for every single state and territory government. Well, the decision has been taken not to extend it. That was a decision put in place by the former government. As the Prime Minister and Treasurer have said, at some point there is not the ability to continue to borrow money.
Well, good on Health Minister Mark Butler there, and I applaud the fiscal discipline of the government, and I hope we see more of that come October when Jim Chalmers hands down his October budget. But it seems to me to be the height of hypocrisy to come to power off the back of a campaign slamming the Morrison government for not providing free rats in the middle of a pandemic, and then not providing free rats when we are supposedly still in the middle of a pandemic. And when you consider that experts, including Dr. Clay Gollidge, who was here on the program last night, agree that if you want to, A, keep the economy going, and B, save lives by getting people, especially vulnerable people and older people, onto antivirals as soon as possible after they test positive, well, it seemed to me that free rat tests would be the way to go. Anyway, enough about the pandemic. I'm sick of it. I'm sure you are too. Instead, let's talk about some economic news that came out today, and which may not be as good news as some of the headlines, and especially some of the politicians are suggesting. I'm talking, of course, about Australia's historically low unemployment numbers, which came out just before lunchtime today. What did they say? Well, on the face of it, that we're in a pretty good position. Nationally, Australia's unemployment has fallen to just 3.5%. It's great. It's the lowest it's been since August 1974. Across most of the states and territories, the story was the same. Big falls in unemployment. New South Wales had a massive fall of 0.7% to just 3.3%. New South Wales Treasurer Matt Keane, who, by the way, recently unveiled his own cash splash budget, which we'll get to in a moment, crowed about the state's success, saying, "How good is New South Wales?" And Premier Dom Perrottet was right there with him. Victoria's rates were much the same, and they came in at 3.2%, pretty much everywhere in the country, except for the NT, Queensland, and Tasmania, showed numbers that seemed to be heading in the right direction. But it's not all good news, because according to one economist I spoke to earlier today, our current employment rates are like the pandemic. Well, they never happened. He said that we are where we would have been had the pre-pandemic rates of employment growth simply continued, as if nothing nasty had ever emerged from that lab or wet market or whatever in Wuhan. Great news? Well, not so fast, because that low unemployment rate is also a leading indicator of what could also be really bad inflation, seriously bad, like the sort we haven't seen here in Australia in decades, which would be terrible because not only would it make your weekly shop and everything else you consume and use and buy more expensive, but because inflation is, when you really look at it, a massive tax on the middle class. It is essentially taxation without representation. It destroys wealth and savings. And it is the direct result, remember that cash splash budget I mentioned before? Of the billions upon billions of dollars shoveled into the economy during the pandemic that will leave your children and your grandchildren with a massive debt to pay off. And now it will leave you with higher prices for everything. As I say, inflation erodes savings, it erodes paychecks, and it is hardest on people without the sort of assets that tend to go up faster than inflation. We have already seen rents rise by 12% over the past year, which suggests that there is a big wave of inflation coming, baked into the economy, and we will start to see it come through when our inflation numbers are released in a couple of weeks. But as we pursue green dreams of net zero emissions, because both labor and coalition governments have made extracting and maintaining and generating power from reliable baseload sources so difficult, we can also see electricity costs have surged, with wholesale prices hitting a new record in June of $349 per megawatt hour and showing no signs of easing anytime soon. That's according to J.P. Morgan. So rents, energy, and that's another inflation input. And then we have these unemployment figures. Now, let me explain. Low unemployment is good, but when unemployment is this low, well, there are concerns that the economy is actually overheating, that inflation is coming, that it is on the way, and that the Reserve Bank will have to go a lot harder on rates to cool things off, lest they get out of control. Let me play a bit of an interview that aired earlier this afternoon on Sky with Associate Professor Steve Hamilton from the ANU. Professor Hamilton says that the Reserve Bank has actually been far too soft on interest rates, and the danger is that inflation is, as a result, about to spiral out of control.
We have massive demand following on from the pandemic, right? Everyone had their kind of demand on hold for 2 years while the economy was shut down. We've reopened and we want to do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before. So we haven't had a read on inflation since March. So we're months and months behind understanding the current state of the economy. I suspect, the US is at 9.1. I suspect we're headed in a similar direction.
So that's the situation. And we just saw overnight the United States hit 9.1% inflation. Well, could that be coming here? And what would that mean for us? Well, 2 points on that. In the U.S., and again, as Professor Hamilton says, there is no reason to think that we are necessarily any different here in Australia. That's a theme we have been hitting all week. We may be a special country, but we are in no way immune to what happens if we do the same stupid things that other countries overseas have done. And speaking of the U.S., let's have a look at what that inflation looks like, because as Professor Hamilton told us, we could be looking at something similar in Australia. Have a look at some of these numbers. While the so-called headline inflation is 9.1% in the U.S., prices of a lot of other things are going up a lot faster. Overall, food, groceries, up 10.4%. Bacon, up almost 12%. Bad news for me. Milk, more than 16% gain. Eggs, up just under a third. Now, muttering Joe Biden, of course, doesn't believe any of that.
We are suffering from inflation imposed as a consequence of what's going on in Ukraine, but we have the lowest rate of almost every major nation in the world.
Well, never mind what he says. The fact is that if you look at the polls, inflation is now the number one concern of voters in the U.S. And while voters in the U.S. believe that the economy has already tipped into recession, remember, most people are harder hit than the economists who measure this stuff and decide when the recession happens, all the formal indicators are there, too, that the U.S. economy is going to tip over the edge. So, do we still need free rats? Are we heading for an inflation apocalypse?